Okay, we're going to move on now. We have the president and the CEO of Resolution One Security coming on the stage to talk with us about preparing for the inevitable, the board and cybersecurity. So please give a round of applause for Craig Carpenter. Mr. Carpenter, come on out.
Well done. Good job.
Is he here? There you are. Hi.
Thank you very much.
Good to see you.
Good afternoon, everybody. So I think it's quite apropos that NATO was up last. They're a customer of ours that have been a very good customer we've worked with for many years. So hopefully everybody learned a little something from them. So my name is Craig Carpenter. I'm the president and COO of a company called Resolution One Security. We are a new company. We spun out from a company called Access Data that's a leader in the forensic space. And what we'd like to talk to you about today is the cross-section between cybersecurity and boards of directors. 2014 was a very interesting year for the awareness of cybersecurity and the need for cybersecurity amongst board members. And so we want to talk about some of the ways that our customers are having success engaging with their boards, educating their boards, and helping their boards understand how cybersecurity needs to be dealt with today going forward. So please feel free to ask questions throughout if you have any. I'll try to leave you a little bit of time at the end for questions as well. So just quickly to go through the agenda, I always like to know what I'm getting myself into before I spend a half hour with somebody. I'll try to break things down and oversimplify them. There's some good news and there's some bad news with respect to boards of directors and cybersecurity. We'll talk about that a little bit. I'll give you a little bit of background on my company just so you have some context for what we'll talk about today. It'll be brief. And then we'll talk about boards. We'll take a look at boards of directors, how they're comprised, what they care about, how they consume their information, and how they look at cybersecurity and their awareness level of cybersecurity. Then we'll talk about 2014. We're all aware of the myriad hacks that took place and the developments in cybersecurity, but I'll touch on a few of them, and I'll try to do it in the context of how boards viewed events that happened in 2014 and how it changed their minds about their companies and cybersecurity. And then we'll wrap things up with what boards should know, what are kind of best practices in terms of what boards of directors should know, and then how we can all educate boards. Whether you're on a board of directors, or you're in IT, or you're in security, or you're in another function, having board involvement can be a blessing and a curse. So having some tips on how to engage with boards and educate them can be very helpful. So first, there's some good news and some bad news coming out of 2014. First is the good news. Security has always been an interesting topic to those of us in the industry, but it wasn't always a front page news item. It wasn't always in the nation's newspapers, and it wasn't always on television programs. That started to change last year. Its popularity or awareness level of security went up drastically last year based on what happened. And so now it's a high-profile topic. It's a board-level topic. Budget for many of the customers we work with is easier to come by for security investments, more so perhaps on the technology side than on the people side, which is not terribly surprising. But at least getting the people who hold the purse strings to understand why investments should be made has gotten easier. Not across the board, but for a lot of companies and a lot of industries. And it's also an opportunity to show the value of security. Security is one of those difficult areas where it's easy to show when things go badly, right? It's obvious to all. It's tougher to show when you prevented something from happening. But with the increased awareness of security, that should hopefully become a little bit easier to do. Now the bad news. Right, here are the challenges that we all are going to deal with this increased scrutiny from board-level individuals. Boards will now be watching, right? This is a topic that boards have a vested interest in because they don't want their company to get hit. They don't want their company to be on the front page of the newspaper talking about a breach or where individual information was released or where employee details were leaked that shouldn't have been. That's a challenge. It can be turned into a blessing, but it's initially certainly a challenge. The biggest challenge that we all have today is that board members didn't grow up in security, right? So they don't understand security. They don't want to understand it. They want it to go away, which is really a challenge because it's really not that simple, as I think all of us would know. So educating them in a way that they can understand is something that is paramount here. And then last but not least, boards are used to binary inputs and outcomes. If we put more money here, we go into a new market or a new region, this will be our outcome. That's not always the way it works in security. Just because you buy another FireEye box or you invest more in your next-gen malware detection tool doesn't mean you're not going to get hit. So that's an area that there's a bit of a disconnect with boards and how they think. So we have some good news and some bad news that we'll walk through as we go through here. So just a couple of slides to give you some background on my company. We work with a lot of the largest governments and multinational corporations in the world. Again, NATO among them. Not just in the verticals that most people think of when they think of big hacks and big security issues like financial services, government, retail, et cetera. There are a lot of other verticals for whom security is paramount, and we engage with all of them. So just to quickly address the problem that we solve, so what's happened in a lot of companies and governments is that they're being inundated by activities, by events, and by alerts. And they don't have an ability to consume them and to separate the wheat from the chaff and understand which ones they should really care about. And the problem is getting worse and worse. So most companies have invested in endpoint technology and network technology, in advanced malware tools, et cetera, and in SIMs. And for an analyst to go in and try to figure out what's happening at any given time, they'll have to go into each individual system and connect the dots on their own, which is very labor-intensive and it's very challenging, especially at a time when there is a dramatic and really pressing shortage of expertise in the cybersecurity realm. There just aren't that many people out there who understand security really well that companies can hire. So this is a challenge that is really companies are falling down with today, and it doesn't scale well at all. This is the exact challenge that we try to address, and we basically try to do it in three ways. By plugging in with all these legacy technologies, we try to give visibility. So what's happening on the endpoint, how does that relate to what's happening on the network and the log data that we're looking at? And what are those three kind of points of light, if you will, trying to tell me? What can I glean from that? That also includes going out and actually proactively looking for things on a network or on endpoints, which to this point has not been something people have done a lot of, but it's becoming very popular. The second is context. So if a company gets thousands of alerts a day, which ones matter? Which ones should I pay attention to? If I only have 5 analysts to look at 5,000 alerts, that's not going to work. So I need to prioritize, obviously. And the last is just empowering people. So rather than having people do mundane, repeatable tasks, have software do that to allow the people to take on more activities and more investigations on any given day. So this is the area where we focus and we spend our time. All right. So quickly, and I don't want to insult your intelligence, but let's take a look at boards of directors and let's understand what they care about and kind of what their function is, because in that way we can understand how really to engage with them and educate them about cybersecurity. So first, not all boards are created the same. There tends to be a split of opinion between Europe and specifically Germany and the US model. In the US model, there tends to be a single board for a company. It's anywhere typically from 5 to 15 individuals. Whereas in Germany, there tends to be split boards. One is an executive board, another is a supervisory board that just kind of split board functions. Whether you're talking about the German model or the US model, boards are directly accountable to their stakeholders or to their shareholders, depending on the company, if it's publicly traded or if it's government owned. And most boards typically have a dual mandate. And I'll dig into this a little bit in the next slide. The first is advisory. So what's the strategic direction of our company? What markets do we play in? What do we want to do? What is our company culture? What are we all about? And then the second is oversight, which is where we'll spend the bulk of our time today. So what's happening at the company? Are good things happening, bad things happening? Do we have insight into bad things before they occur? So concerns of a board. So these are the things that boards pay attention to, and here's what keeps them up at night, if you will. And we'll get into a little more detail as we go. So first, and what most people are familiar with is the hiring and firing of key executives. So most often you hear about in the context of a CEO who's lost their job. That's the board's job. And then to conduct the search for the next CEO, that's a core part of what they do, but it extends beyond just the CEO. It typically involves a COO, CFO, and then various heads of groups. The board gets involved there. We talked about the strategic direction of a company. The CEO and the executive staff are heavily involved with that, but the board has to bless that. Employee relations, I think especially in Europe as opposed to the US, is critical to a board. Dealing with works councils, dealing with various unions is a key component of the board. Obviously, the CEO gets involved as well. And then the last three here is really, this is the area that keeps boards up at night. The first is corporate governance, right? Are we doing the things we're supposed to be doing? Are we going to be investigated for any number of reasons? And if we are, how is that going to end? Is it going to end poorly? Is it going to end well? Second is monitoring of corporate performance and activities, which is a little bit tougher for a board. They are only looking at a very, very small number of metrics or data points to see if the company's on track. They rely much more on the executive staff to understand if they're on track or not. And then the last one is a specialty of most boards, and it's what we'll spend. It's really the context in which we'll talk about cybersecurity, and that's risk management. Because if the board has one job, it's to protect the company. It's to keep the company growing and to keep the viability and the value of the company intact. And anything that threatens that falls under the heading of risk management. So let's talk about board attitudes. So, and especially in the context of cybersecurity, you know, how do boards approach cybersecurity? What do they think about when they think of cybersecurity? So first and foremost, board members are just like everyday people. They read about breaches in newspapers. They'll read a German newspaper. They'll read a national magazine. They'll read Economist, whatever, and they'll read about breaches in that context. So they'll have a high-level perspective of it, but they won't really know the details, okay? But they will definitely be aware of what's happening because, especially in a year like 2014, when breaches are constantly in the press. Second, typically what they'll do is once they encounter a situation that they think may threaten their company, they'll get together as a group and say, this is a priority of ours. And then what happens typically is they and the CEO will go to a CIO or a CISO and say, this can't happen, okay? Which is helpful but also unhelpful because a CIO or a CISO probably already knows that this can't happen, and they may have tried to make some investments or do something that would have helped them prevent it from happening. And now it's helpful because the board will be involved and support that effort theoretically. And it's unhelpful because the board's expectation will be that it won't happen. Once the board says it shouldn't happen, then it won't happen, and it's not always the way it works out. Then the key staff, remember they were hired by the board, so they want to appease the board. So they effectively will focus their budget the way they always have. And if you divide security into three areas, one is prevention, one is detection, and one is response, budgets have predominantly traditionally been spent in prevention, okay? The challenge is that, and you still need prevention, but prevention alone is no longer working, right? And that's generally been accepted amongst the security industry, which is why you've seen tremendous growth in the detection realm. Something's going to get through my preventative measures. I need to be able to detect it, okay? But the next step from that is responding, right? So now I've detected something, now what do I do? And if I'm detecting more and more things, I need to be able to do more on the response side of things. So CIOs and CISOs, their budget thinking is evolving very slowly because the board hasn't really forced them to go in that direction quite yet. Some organizations have. NATO is definitely an example of one that has. But given their mandate, they had to from day one. Interestingly enough, if you look at some of the prognosticators in the industry, in this case Gartner, they are anticipating that this change is going to take place very rapidly over the course of the next 5 to 6 years, and that budgets will basically go from being preventative or prophylactic to being about detection and response. But all of this, again, is detailed beyond the ken of most boards at this point in time. So one thing that is interesting is that in the realm of risk management, what took place in 2014. So boards of directors typically were focused on financial risk. They were focused on regulatory risk, CEO succession planning, et cetera. That's why you see, these are areas that have always scored high on boards' concern list, if you will. What happened last year was very interesting, was that cybersecurity and IT risk, which was number 3 or 4 on the list, jumped up to number 2. And it rose a full 9 percentage points, which is a huge jump for boards of directors from last year. So the obvious question is, okay, so what happened last year that made boards all of a sudden become aware of and concerned about cybersecurity? So, and I'm guessing that this has been talked about quite a bit today. We all know the story about Edward Snowden, National Security Agency, his disclosures, no matter how you look at him, but I think they opened a lot of people's eyes. And just the volume and scale of the wiretapping and other kind of monitoring activity that was taking place globally, and not just government to government, but government to private sector, I think surprised a lot of people. This also got on boards' radars. This concerned boards because it wasn't just the NSA tapping into Angela Merkel's cell phone bad as that was, it was also tapping into Siemens and what Siemens was doing. And was that information then passed to IBM or to another company that was a competitor of Siemens that happened to be a US company? That becomes a board level issue, and that changed the game for most boards of directors. Next, we had, if you recall, the Reagan Regin malware that came out late last year. And this was uncovered by several security vendors. And one of them found it on the Belgacom network. And if you were to believe the stories that were written, this may have been promulgated by GCHQ, which is part of the British Secret Service apparatus. And you may wonder, well, why would they want to tap into a Belgian telco? Well, if that particular Belgian telco happens to support the telephone lines and other networking apparatus in, for example, Brussels, there might be some interesting information for the UK government to know there, right? And perhaps that information was being shared with other governments, like the US. Again, this is something that basically got boards to realize that, they're going to get scooped up in this stuff too. Even if, they don't happen to be the target, this is a company, this is a risk to any company. And these, by the way, this is just a cross-section of what happened in 2014. Then we had a whole wave of retail hacks. It was predominantly focused on the US, but it wasn't limited to the US. So, for example, Neiman Marcus had over 1 million, generally relatively high net worth individuals' account information stolen. Then you had Target, who had 40 million accounts stolen right at the peak of the buying season. Then you had the Home Depot, which is a big home improvement chain, had their information, of roughly 55 million individuals stolen, right? So this tells you how quickly and how easily people can break into networks that should be pretty well protected because they have plenty of money and plenty of analysts that are focusing on these networks, and yet they're still being breached. And lest we think it is only retail or government or telco that are being attacked, banks were hit. JP Morgan Chase, which is arguably one of the best defended banks in the world, got hit late last year. Adobe, which is a very well-known software vendor. eBay, which probably has one of the most sophisticated cybersecurity teams of any technology company outside of Google, was hit. And then myriad healthcare firms in the US and outside the US were hit for any number of reasons. And then last year, we ended with Sony, right? And Sony became a bit of a watershed moment because before Sony, the worst case scenario was something that happened to Target or to Belgacom, and it damaged reputation, and there were some significant costs associated with it, but that was as bad as it was going to get. Maybe a CEO got fired, okay? But then you had Sony. You had one of the most recognizable brands in the world whose company was effectively taken hostage for a couple of months. And that really woke up boards of directors all over the world because they thought, what would happen if we were in their shoes, right? You're completely helpless. There's nothing you can do. Your company has literally been taken hostage by the North Koreans, if you're going to believe the FBI, or by hacktivists, if you're going to believe the majority of the security industry, right? That's an entirely new level of worst case scenario. So all of this really kind of fed on itself and got boards of directors very, very concerned, which is why you saw the statistic I showed earlier of this real spike in board level concern, right? So from a board perspective, what did all of those disparate events mean to them, right? How did they digest that? So first, the breaches started impacting revenue and profit. That was new. That had never happened before. So when Target got hit, that was the first major company that had had their earnings take a big hit. And if there's one thing that boards of directors pay attention to, it's earnings. It's revenue, it's profit, how much are we growing, what's our stock price. And when stock prices start dropping, revenue starts dropping, and profit goes down, then that particular board is failing, right? That's the board's scoreboard, if you will. Second, not one, but multiple Fortune 500 CEOs lost their jobs, right? And at least in the case of Target, the board that had hired that CEO then had to fire that CEO, partly, not entirely, but partly due to the breach and the fallout from that particular breach. There's nothing worse for a board than to admit failure on someone that they had hired and brought on board and spent, millions of dollars recruiting, and then have to fire them and hire someone new. That's another admission of defeat, right? So these are the sorts of things that make boards very, very nervous. We talked about the global nation-state cyber activity that was widely exposed. I think it was the volume and the breadth of it that was exposed. I think most people assume that there was spying going on, in the US at least, China is perceived to have hacked into a lot of US companies, but that's generally for corporate espionage type activity. When you talk about the allegations that Snowden made, that the NSA was, the level and volume of hacking they were undertaking was on a whole new level that made boards very, very nervous. And last but not least was the Sony effect, right? It was a totally new worst case scenario that really got boards concerned. So you put all these things together and you have a collection of boards that are very, very concerned. Okay, so we have their attention now, right? We as CIOs or CISOs or practitioners, what do we want to do, right? This is our opportunity. We've complained for many, many years that we didn't have their attention. Now we finally have it. So the first and most important thing that a board needs to know, and boards do not know until they've been educated about this, is that that particular entity, whether you're talking about a government entity, a company, it will get breached. There will be malware somewhere on a corporate system, on some endpoint, on some server at some point in time, and it's going to happen repeatedly, okay? And that may seem like something that's intuitive if you've dealt with the security industry for many, many years, but to boards of directors, it's not. Their thinking is if we hire another security guard for our facility, that'll protect it from getting robbed, okay? And the cyber world works a little bit differently, so that's critical. Second is where the companies that really got hit hard fell down and put Target and Sony chief among them, was the speed to discovery and the speed of containment of whatever the breach was. In Target's case, they actually detected the breach. 2 separate systems detected the breach, the Symantec endpoint protection and the FireEye box. The problem was, one was a network tool, one was an endpoint tool. The alerts went to totally different teams, and they were mixed in with thousands of other alerts, okay? They didn't discover it and contain it quickly enough, and so they lost 40 million customer accounts. That's critical. Third, more bodies are not the answer. That's typically going to be a board's response. Well, let's bring in some consultants, right? Let's hire KPMG, let's hire Deloitte, somebody to come in here and fix it for us. That doesn't always work, okay? And it's not going to work in this case because the expertise is hard to find and stuff is happening way too quickly and way too frequently to be able to address it that way. Be proactive. Boards love the idea of being proactive because then if something bad happens, they're able to go out to the outside world and say, well, look, yes, we got hit, but we were being proactive here. We were working very hard to do more than just the baseline minimum that all of our competitors are doing. That's a message that will resonate with them a great deal. And then last but not least, and I think, not to pick on Sony, but Sony is a good example of how this can work poorly, communication. And in Sony's case, it was very difficult because their email systems were down. Everything was down. Their endpoints were compromised. Their mobile devices were compromised. So communication was very difficult for them. But if there's something as the outside world that you notice when a breach occurs, it's companies that handle communication well versus those that don't. Have you been breached? Do you know how bad it was yet? Who's been implicated? What are you going to do to fix it? How should I know I can trust you going forward? These are critical questions that the board needs to understand that there needs to be a plan in place before an event occurs, because by the time an event happens, it's way too late. So how to educate boards, and kind of what are the learnings that we have as practitioners from 2014. So again, this is an opportunity, right? Let's not let it go to waste. 2014 is an opportunity for us to get boards to understand the importance of security. Second, and this is critical, boards are not security experts. They're not even IT experts, right? They wouldn't know a server in a restaurant from a server in a rack, okay? So helping them understand what security is about and what the risks are and what's needed is critical. And not dumbing it down, but putting it in a language they can understand is very, very important. The status quo of a particular security setting is important because what will happen is a board will say, well, we need to be here. And if a company is only here and a board member doesn't understand that, they will get very frustrated that we're not here yet. So educating them on here's what we can do, here's what we can't do, and where you need to get to and how you're going to get there is critical. We had a customer that went through this very same scenario in the healthcare space in US, and that took them several board meetings, but they eventually got there because the board members' initial expectation was that the company was going to be able to shut everything down within a matter of 2 minutes and discover it right away. That's simply not where they were. Projects must be realistic in scope and in goals, right? A board can't expect an IT team or a security team to be able to go from 0 to 60 too quickly. So setting board expectations are very important. And last but not least, all boards think in terms of metrics, right? They can't manage the business at an overly granular level. So what they do is they focus on key performance indicators or key metrics. And 3 metrics that we've seen garner a lot of success in the industry when it comes to incident response are mean time to validation. So how long does it take before we can validate any particular alert that we receive? Mean time to respond. So once we get an alert that we need to respond to, how long does it take us to contain that particular breach or piece of malware? And then last but not least, how long does it take for us to resolve? So we've responded, we've validated something, we've responded to it. Now we need to fix it, we need to resolve it. How long does it take us to get to that resolution point? Okay, these are key metrics that board members will gravitate to very, very well. So I think this is my second to last slide, just in terms of more board advice. So to the extent possible, quarterly briefings by internal security and an external monitoring firm are always a good idea, right? Keep in front of the board, giving them advice as to what's happening, educating them as to what's going on, et cetera, is always helpful. This is a bit of a controversial thing in the security industry, but typically what we've seen work better is if there's a CISO function, the CISO reports directly into a COO or CEO rather than through a CIO. And the reason for that is that oftentimes a CISO's mandate is different from a CIO. A CIO's mandate is uptime, it's efficiency, and it's helping the workers work as efficiently as they can, which is critical. But a CISO's mandate can be very different. It's protecting the business. And those 2 mandates can sometimes come in conflict. The board should pull in an outside firm to audit the status of any company's cybersecurity readiness and preparedness, right? It's effectively a checkup on the company that's done in an unbiased fashion, and boards should want to do that. And then in a completely biased vein, we feel strongly that companies that are doing cybersecurity well are investing further in detection and response capabilities, right? That's an area of great deal of growth right now, and that's where boards should be focusing their attention. So I'm almost out of time here. Sorry to run through that super quickly, but wanted to make sure we got through all the content. We have a minute or 2 left for questions if there are any questions. No questions. Not a problem. If you have any questions or you're too shy to ask, we are in Hall 6, stand B25, and please come visit us at our booth. We also have a free community tool that if you wanted to download to see if there's anything bad on your particular laptop that you can play with if you want. There'll be some ladies at the back of the room handing out cards to help you do that. Otherwise, thank you very much for your time, and please enjoy CeBIT.